"Please, just make it quick," she said. But the rancher lifted her in his arms and rode into the vast hills. The sun was setting behind the vast hills of the ranch, casting a golden glow over the fields. The wind blew softly, carrying the sweet scent of earth and grass. It was a peaceful evening, the kind the rancher had known all his life. His name was Jack, a man who had spent most of his days working the land alone. The ranch had been his only companion, and he liked it that way. There was no one to bother him, no distractions, just the quiet of the open country and the hard work that came with it. Jack was tall, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that told the story of a life spent laboring under the sun. His face was weathered from years of exposure to the elements, but his blue eyes, though tired, still held a glimmer of something deeper. Perhaps a reminder of the man he used to be before life turned him into a loner. He'd seen hardship and loss, but he had learned to keep his emotions locked away. There was no place for sentimentality in a life like his. He had been working on the ranch all day, mending fences and checking on the cattle. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and looked around, taking in the peace of his surroundings. Inspiration. It was quiet here. Too quiet sometimes. But that's how he liked it. The silence was his comfort. Just as Jack began to head back toward his small cabin, he heard a sound. A soft rustling coming from the direction of the barn. It was faint at first, but then a figure appeared through the tall grass. Jack froze for a moment, squinting into the dimming light. A woman. She was stumbling toward him, her steps uneven, as if she had been walking for miles. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair tangled and wild, and her face pale with exhaustion. She looked as though she had been through hell. Jack's first instinct was to turn away, to keep his distance. The last thing he needed was trouble, but something about her, a look in her eyes, stopped him. She was desperate. The woman collapsed at his feet, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and something else, maybe pain, maybe sorrow. Jack could tell she was struggling to stay conscious. She reached out, her hand trembling, and whispered, "Please, just make it quick." Jack stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He had been alone on this land for so long that the sight of another person, especially one in such distress, felt foreign. But he wasn't the type of man to turn away someone in need, no matter how strange the situation.
"Easy there," Jack said, his voice rough but steady.
He bent down, kneeling beside her. "What happened to you?" The woman's eyes flickered, but she didn't answer. Instead, she let out a weak, pained laugh, almost as if the question didn't matter. Her lips trembled, and she spoke again, this time with more urgency. "Please, just make it quick. I can't go on anymore." Jack didn't understand. He had seen plenty of hardship in his life, but this woman's words confused him. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her. "You're safe now."
"I'm not going to hurt you."
The woman closed her eyes, and for a brief moment it seemed as though she was already gone. Jack's mind raced. He didn't know what to do, but then she stirred, just enough for him to hear her speak again, her voice faint and broken. "They're coming for me," she said, barely audible. "I had no choice. I had to run. Please, just make it quick. I am so tired of running." Jack frowned, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in his chest. This wasn't just some random traveler. She was running from something. Or someone. But who could it be? And why was she so willing to give up on life? Breaths. He didn't have the answers, but there was one thing he did know. He couldn't leave her out here like this. He carefully helped the woman to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed, barely able to stand on her own. But she didn't resist. Her eyes were hollow, full of something Jack couldn't quite place. Fear? Pain? Desperation? He couldn't tell.
But he wasn't about to turn her away. She needed help, whether she knew it or not.
I'm not going to make it quick, Jack said quietly, his voice firm. You're not done yet. The woman's lips parted in a weak smile, as if she didn't believe him. But Jack wasn't the type to make false promises. He wasn't going to tell her that everything would be fine. Breaths. He didn't know that for sure. But what he did know was that she wasn't going to die on his land. Not if he could help it. Jack helped her inside his cabin where the dim light of the oil lamps flickered softly. He set her down on the small cot he kept by the fire, carefully tucking the blankets around her. Despised. She looked so fragile, like she might break at any moment. Jack had never seen someone so broken, so defeated. He couldn't understand it, not fully. But there was something in the way she looked at him, a silent plea for help, that made his chest tighten. "I'll get you something to drink," Jack said, moving toward the kitchen area. He didn't know what else to say, and he wasn't good with words anyway. His actions had always spoken louder than anything he could say. He poured a glass of water and brought it back to her. The woman barely moved as he lifted her head, allowing her to drink. She sipped slowly, her hands still trembling. Jack could tell she wasn't used to being cared for. She didn't know how to let someone else take charge, how to trust anyone again. Her life had clearly been hard, and it had taken everything from her. "Who's after you?" Jack asked quietly, setting the glass down beside her. His voice was softer now, but the question still hung in the air. Phew. The woman didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the ceiling, her eyes distant. I don't want to talk about it," she whispered. "I just want to forget." Jack nodded, sensing that she wasn't ready to share her story. He respected that. She didn't have to explain herself to him, but he knew one thing. Whatever had brought her to this point, it was something dark, something that had scarred her deeply. Jack sat down on the chair beside the bed, watching her closely. He wasn't sure what the future held for this woman, or for him, for that matter. But he knew one thing. This moment, this choice, was something neither of them would forget. As the night stretched on, Jack stayed by her side. He didn't know what to say or do, but somehow being there felt like the right thing. She had come to him for help, and though she didn't trust him yet, she was here. And that was a start. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the woman had fallen into a restless sleep, her face softening in the quiet warmth of the cabin. Jack stayed awake, keeping watch, his thoughts racing. He didn't know what had brought her here, but he wasn't about to leave her to face it alone. Tomorrow, he would figure out what to do. For now, he would let her rest. She had been through too much already. The morning light filtered through the small cabin, casting soft shadows across the worn wooden floor. Jack had barely slept. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, thinking about the woman in the next room. He couldn't shake the image of her fragile state, her desperate plea for help. It wasn't like him to get involved with people, especially strangers. But something about her had gotten under his skin, and now there was no turning back. As the first rays of sunlight touched the land outside, Jack stood up from his chair, stretching his stiff muscles. His mind was heavy, filled with questions that he couldn't answer. Who was this woman? What had she been running from? And why had she come to him, of all people? These questions lingered in his mind as he walked into the kitchen to prepare some coffee, trying to clear his head. He was used to solitude. The ranch had been his retreat from the world for years. It was where he had found peace after losing his wife many years ago, and where he had buried his heart. There was no room for anything else here, no space for emotions or attachments. But now, that quiet life was being upended by this woman, whose brokenness seemed to call out to him in ways he didn't fully understand. He heard her stir from the next room, a soft groan that made him pause. She had been asleep most of the night, but Jack knew she hadn't found peace. She never did. Not with the fear that still clung to her. He poured the coffee and set it down on the small wooden table by the window. He wasn't sure if she would even drink it, but it was the least he could do. The woman slowly emerged from the room, her movements slow and cautious. She was still weak, but her eyes were clearer now, no longer clouded with the exhaustion of her desperate escape. She looked at Jack with uncertainty, as if she didn't know what to expect from him. Jack met her gaze but didn't say anything at first. He simply gestured toward the table.
I made coffee.
You should drink something, he said, his voice low and rough, like it always was when he hadn't spoken much. The woman nodded, though she didn't sit down right away. She seemed hesitant, like she wasn't sure whether she should accept his offer or walk away. Jack could tell that she wasn't used to kindness, that it was foreign to her in some way. She had been on her own for so long that she had probably forgotten what it felt like to trust anyone.
Slowly, she sat down, her body still stiff from the tension that had gripped her for so long.
She reached for the cup of coffee, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it. Jack watched her closely, noticing the weariness that still clung to her. But there was something else in her eyes now, something that spoke of hope, even if it was faint.
"Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft, almost fragile.
Birth. I didn't think anyone would help me. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a seat across from her, his hands resting on the table as he watched her sip the coffee. He was trying to figure out what to say, how to navigate this strange situation he found himself in. He had never been good with words, especially when emotions were involved. But this woman, this stranger, had somehow managed to break through the walls he had spent years building around himself. You're safe here, Jack said, his voice firm but gentle. But I need to know what happened. What are you running from? The woman flinched at the question, her body tensing as if the very mention of it brought back painful memories. She didn't look up at him right away, instead staring down at the coffee in her hands. Jack didn't push her, knowing that the answer would come when she was ready.
Ah! He had learned over the years that pushing people to talk before they were ready only led to more hurt.
I can't go back, she said after a long silence, her voice barely above a whisper.
There's nothing for me there anymore. Nothing but pain and fear. I had to leave. Jack leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully.
I don't know what happened to you, but you're safe here for now. I'm not asking you to stay forever, but I can't just turn you away.
The woman's eyes flickered up to meet his for the first time since she had sat down. There was a flash of something in them. Relief, maybe, or a glimmer of hope. It was brief, but Jack saw it.
I don't know if I can stay, she said quietly, her voice catching slightly.
I don't know if I can ever feel safe again. Jack didn't know what to say to that. He could feel her pain, her fear weighing heavily in the room. But he also knew something else. She was stronger than she thought. People didn't survive what she had been through without a certain strength. He could see it in her, even if she couldn't see it herself. "You'll figure it out," Jack said, his voice steady. "But you're not alone. Not anymore." The woman seemed to absorb his words, though she still looked uncertain. Jack wasn't sure if his promise meant anything to her, but he meant it. He wasn't one for empty words. Pressed, he had his own scars, his own regrets, but he wasn't about to let this woman face whatever came next on her own. For the rest of the day, Jack and the woman, whose name he had learned was Emily, stayed in the cabin. Jack went about his usual tasks, checking on the cattle and tending to the land, but he made sure Emily was comfortable. She didn't say much, but she watched him closely, her eyes following his every move. There was a quiet tension between them, as if neither of them knew what to expect, but they both knew things had changed.
As the day wore on, Emily slowly began to open up more.
She helped Jack with some of the lighter tasks, though she wasn't strong enough for anything too strenuous. She cleaned the dishes and folded the laundry, keeping herself busy while Jack worked outside. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a silent agreement that neither of them would bring up the past unless it was absolutely necessary. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to fill the sky, Jack found himself sitting by the fire, something he hadn't done in a long time. The warmth from the flames spread through the room, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack didn't feel so alone. Emily sat across from him, her face soft in the firelight. She didn't look as broken as she had when she first arrived, though the shadows in her eyes were still there. Jack didn't know if they would ever fade, but he knew one thing: she was still alive, still fighting, and that was enough for him.
But I can't just send you out there, not like this. Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable.
I don't have anywhere else to go. Jack nodded slowly. Then stay here for as long as you need to. I don't know what you're running from, but you don't have to face it alone. Emily's eyes softened, and for the first time she gave him a small, tentative smile. Thank you, she said quietly. Jack didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Breath. He had made his decision, and for now that was enough. Whatever lay ahead for Emily, whatever was chasing her, Jack knew that he had given her something precious, a chance to heal, to find herself again. The days following Emily's arrival passed slowly, each one blending into the next. Jack had offered her safety, but she wasn't sure she could trust the quiet peace of the ranch for long. The fear still gnawed at her, like an invisible shadow, always lingering just out of reach. The constant worry of being hunted, of the past catching up to her, never fully left her. But Jack's presence, his quiet strength, gave her moments of calm she hadn't known in a long time. For a few days, they settled into a routine. Emily helped Jack around the cabin, though she still wasn't strong enough for much. She would fetch water, clean the dishes, and occasionally tend to the small garden Jack had started behind the cabin. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the crackle of the flames, the only sound in the otherwise still night. Jack didn't push her to talk, and Emily didn't ask too many questions. They lived in the quiet comfort of unspoken understanding. But as the days wore on, something began to change. The weight of the silence grew heavier. Jack had hoped that time would give Emily the space she needed to heal, to feel safe again. But the tension in her eyes never fully disappeared, and he knew that the danger she was running from was still very real. He couldn't keep her here forever.
One afternoon, Jack was out in the fields, repairing a broken fence, when he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves in the distance.
Bear. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or maybe a stray animal. But then he heard it again, louder this time.
His heart skipped a beat as he looked up, scanning the horizon.
He saw them before they saw him. 2 riders heading straight for the ranch. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't recognize them, but the way they were riding, fast and determined, told him everything he needed to know. They were looking for someone, and that someone was probably Emily. His mind raced. He didn't have much time. Jack moved quickly, making his way back to the cabin as fast as he could. He needed to get to Emily before they did. He burst through the door, finding her sitting at the table, staring out the window. She looked up at him in surprise, her expression softening when she saw the urgency in his face. "Bray."
"They're coming," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "You need to get ready."
"We're leaving."
Emily's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she stood up.
She didn't ask questions, didn't argue. She simply nodded, her instincts kicking in. She had been running for so long that she didn't need to be told twice. She had learned to move quickly, to always be ready for what might come next. Jack grabbed a small leather bag from the corner, stuffing a few supplies inside: water, a blanket, some bread, and handed it to Emily. "We'll take the horses."
"We'll go through the back trail. It's the fastest way out of here," he said.
Emily nodded again, her face set with determination. She had never been one to show fear, not out loud. But Jack could see it in her eyes now, a flicker of panic that she couldn't hide. The past was coming for her, and there was no way to escape it for good. As they stepped outside, Jack led the horses to the small stable. The day had turned gray, with dark clouds rolling in from the west, as if the sky itself was warning them of the storm to come. Jack helped Emily onto one of the horses, then mounted his own, keeping his gaze focused on the horizon. He couldn't afford to look back.
Desp.
He had to stay ahead of them.
Stay close,
Jack said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest.
"Don't fall behind, and don't stop until we're far enough away."
They rode in silence, the sound of the horses' hooves pounding against the earth, the only noise between them. Jack kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his mind running through every possible escape route. He had lived his life in isolation, but he knew the land better than anyone. He knew where the hidden paths were, the places where no one would think to look. The wind picked up, making the trees sway as they passed by. Breath. Jack could feel the weight of the silence between them, the tension thick in the air. He kept stealing glances at Emily, who was gripping the reins tightly, her knuckles white. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear, but she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. They both knew what was at stake. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail. Jack urged the horse forward, pushing them both faster. He didn't know how much time they had before the riders caught up. He didn't know how many were out there. Breath. He only knew that he had to get Emily to safety. After what felt like hours, they reached the narrow pass that Jack had planned to use. It was hidden from view, a small, winding trail that would lead them deep into the mountains. It wasn't the most direct route, but it was the safest one. No one would be able to follow them through here. But as they neared the pass, Jack heard it, a faint noise in the distance. The sound of horses. It was growing louder. His heart skipped a beat. They were closer than he had hoped. Jack turned to Emily, his face set in grim determination. "We have to move faster. Stay with me." They pushed the horses harder, racing through the narrow pass, the trees closing in around them. The trail was rocky and uneven, but Jack knew it well. He had ridden these paths 100 times before. This time, though, the stakes were higher. The sound of the riders grew louder, echoing through the pass. Jack's pulse quickened. They weren't far behind now. He could hear the thundering hooves, the shouts of men, their voices carried on the wind. They reached the end of the pass, and Jack guided the horses to a small clearing. There, hidden from view, was a small cave, a place Jack had used in the past when he needed to lay low. It wasn't much, but it would have to do.
Get off the horse, Jack said urgently, helping Emily down. Stay inside the cave.
I'll keep watch. Emily didn't argue. She moved quickly, ducking into the cave, her eyes wide with fear. Jack followed her inside, looking out from the mouth of the cave. He could see the riders now, their figures just barely visible in the distance, coming through the pass. They hadn't seen them yet, but Jack knew they wouldn't be far behind. As Emily huddled in the back of the cave, Jack stood at the entrance, his heart racing. He wasn't sure how long they would need to wait, but he knew they couldn't stay here forever. The riders were coming closer, and time was running out. Round. Jack's mind raced, trying to think of their next move. He couldn't risk a fight. He had to get Emily away from them no matter the cost. But the only way out was through the pass, and that was the very route the riders were taking. The shadows in the cave grew longer as Jack stood at the entrance, his eyes scanning the narrow pass for any sign of movement. His heart was pounding in his chest. He could hear the distant sound of hooves growing louder, echoing off the rocks. The riders were getting closer, and he had only moments to decide what to do. Emily sat quietly in the back of the cave, her face pale and tense. She was trying to keep her breathing steady, but Jack could see the fear in her eyes. She had been through so much already, and now they were both trapped. With nowhere to run, her hands clenched the edges of her cloak, the only thing she had left that felt like a shield against the danger closing in on them. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered, his voice low and steady. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His instincts screamed that they couldn't stay hidden much longer. They needed to move, but every option seemed more dangerous than the last. The riders were closer now. Jack could make out their figures, dark against the fading light of the day.
There were at least 3 of them, maybe more. And they weren't slowing down. They had the advantage.
They knew the land, and they were determined. They weren't going to let anyone slip through their fingers, especially not Emily. Jack's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He had known there would be danger, but this was different. This wasn't just about protecting his land or keeping things quiet. Boss. This was about survival. His and Emily's. The riders were now within shouting distance. Jack's heart leapt into his throat. He couldn't let them get any closer. There was no way they'd be able to outrun them, not with the terrain as rugged as it was. Jack had seen enough of the world to know that when you were cornered, sometimes the only choice was to fight back. He turned to Emily, his voice firm.
"Stay here. Don't move until I tell you." Emily nodded, though her eyes betrayed her worry.
But she knew Jack was about to do something risky, something that could put them both in even more danger. But she didn't argue. She had learned to trust him over the past few days, even though her heart was still heavy with the fear of being caught. Jack moved to the mouth of the cave, crouching low to keep out of sight. He could hear the riders now, their voices drifting through the air. They were close, and they were getting closer by the second. "I don't want to have to hurt anyone," Jack muttered to himself, his hands resting on the rifle he had brought along. It had been years since he'd had to use it, but the weight of the weapon felt familiar in his hands. It was a tool of survival, and right now it was the only thing standing between him and the danger that was closing in. As the riders neared, Jack's mind raced. He needed to buy them time. He needed to get them away from the cave before they could catch a glimpse of Emily. He wasn't sure how, but he knew that if they saw her, they wouldn't stop until they had her. They'd been hunting her for too long, and Jack wasn't about to let that happen on his watch. He waited, holding his breath as the riders drew closer. He could see them now, their horses kicking up dust as they rode through the narrow pass. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't afraid of them. He was afraid of what would happen to Emily if they found her. He had already made the decision to protect her, no matter what the cost. The riders were almost at the mouth of the cave when Jack made his move. He stepped out from behind the rocks, raising the rifle but not aiming it directly at them.
He wanted to send a message, not to start a fight. His voice rang out strong and clear.
"Stay back!" Jack called, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "You're not welcome here!" The riders jerked their horses to a halt, clearly surprised by the sudden appearance of Jack. They hadn't expected anyone to be there, let alone someone who wasn't afraid to stand his ground. They looked at each other for a moment, sizing Jack up, then slowly turned their attention to the cave behind him. "You're hiding something," one of the riders said, his voice low and menacing. "We know she's here. We've been tracking her for days." Jack stood his ground, his eyes hard. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said firmly.
I don't care who you are or what you think you're owed. She's safe here."
Breaths, the rider sneered, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "We'll see about that." He knew this could escalate quickly. The rider was itching for a fight, and Jack didn't have the luxury of time to reason with him. His hand tightened around the rifle, and he stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and the cave. He had to make them back off. He couldn't let them get any closer to Emily. "You don't want to do this," Jack said, his voice low and calm, though his pulse raced in his ears. "I won't let you hurt her." The rider hesitated for a moment, clearly assessing Jack. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack knew that if he moved, if he made one wrong step, the situation could turn violent in an instant. And then it would be too late. "We don't want trouble," the second rider spoke up, his tone less confrontational. "Just give us the girl, and we'll be on our way." Jack shook his head.
I told you, she's not going with you. The first rider, the one who had spoken earlier, drew his gun, and Jack's heart skipped a beat.
This was it. The situation was about to turn into a fight for their lives. Before the rider could fire, Jack lunged forward, knocking the rifle out of his hand. The two men wrestled for a moment, the sound of grunts and scuffling filling the air. Grasp. Jack fought with every ounce of strength he had, driven by the need to protect Emily. The other rider was slower to react, and Jack used that to his advantage. He spun around, kicking the second rider's horse, sending it rearing back. The rider lost his balance and tumbled off, hitting the ground with a thud. Jack had the upper hand for a moment, but he knew this wasn't over yet. The first rider was back on his feet, and he wasn't about to give up without a fight. The gunshot rang out, the sound of a bullet whizzing past Jack's ear. He ducked just in time, his instincts kicking in. Braked. This wasn't the first time he had faced danger, but it was the most desperate. The battle raged on, but Jack was determined. He fought with everything he had, not for himself, but for the woman who had found her way into his life, the woman he had promised to protect, no matter what. Brace. The quiet of the mountains had returned, but the air was still thick with tension. The fight had been over in a matter of minutes, but the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on Jack's chest. He stood over the two riders, their horses now scattered and their bodies left behind, the sounds of their struggle echoing in his ears. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but it was fading now, leaving him with a deep sense of exhaustion. He turned to Emily, who was standing in the cave entrance, her wide eyes taking in the scene. She had heard the commotion but hadn't dared come out. She had trusted Jack, but the sight of the violence, the raw power of the fight made her nervous. Breaths. She wasn't used to seeing people fight for her, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it.
Are they gone? She asked quietly, her voice soft with fear and disbelief.
Jack nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead as he moved toward her. They won't be coming back.
They'll think twice before crossing me again. Emily didn't say anything at first.
Asking. She just stared at him, as if trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Jack could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear, the relief, and something else. Something she wasn't sure how to name. She had never expected to find herself in a place like this, in a situation where someone would fight for her, someone who had no reason to. She stepped forward slowly, the weight of everything still pressing down on her. Breath. She had thought she could face the world alone, that running would be enough to escape her past, but now, standing here in this hidden cave with Jack, she realized something important. She had never truly been alone. Not really. There were always people willing to help if only she allowed herself to trust them.
I don't know how to thank you, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper.
You saved me again. Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. He had never been one for words, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But something inside him stirred, something that told him he couldn't just walk away from this. From her.
You don't need to thank me, he said simply, his voice gruff but steady. I promised you I'd protect you.
That's all.
Emily nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced.
But she had always been the one to look out for herself, to rely on her own strength. But Jack's words, his actions, were changing something inside her. For the first time in a long time she wasn't alone, and maybe that was what scared her most of all. They stood there for a while, both of them lost in their thoughts. The sun had set, and the sky was slowly darkening. The crackling of the fire Jack had started was the only sound breaking the silence. They didn't speak for a long time, each of them processing the events of the day in their own way. Bay. Finally, Jack broke the silence. We should move on, he said, his voice calm.
We can't stay here too long. It's too dangerous.
Bay. Emily looked at him, her brow furrowed in concern. Where will we go? Jack hesitated for a moment. He didn't have all the answers, and he certainly didn't have a perfect plan. But he knew the land. He knew where to hide, and he knew that as long as they were together, they could make it through anything. We'll keep moving, he said, his voice steady. We'll find a place, a new start. I know this land. I'll take you somewhere safe. Emily didn't argue. She had no reason to doubt him. She had already seen what he was capable of. He had fought for her without hesitation, without a second thought. He had shown her that there was still goodness in the world, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. Jack helped her back onto the horse, his movements careful but steady. He had never been a man of many words, but in that moment he didn't need to say anything more. They both understood what needed to be done. They had a long road ahead of them, and there would be challenges along the way. But for the first time, Emily felt like there was hope. There was a chance for something better, something more than just running and hiding. They rode through the night, the sky above them slowly turning from deep blue to the pale light of dawn. Jack kept his eyes on the trail, guiding the horse through the rough terrain. Emily stayed close, her hands gripping the reins tightly, her body still sore from the events of the previous day. As they rode, Jack couldn't help but think about the journey ahead. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. The past was something they both carried, but it didn't have to define them. They could start over, build a new life, away from the people and the dangers that had chased her all this time. They reached a small, secluded valley as the sun rose, casting a warm golden light over the land. Jack led the horse to a small creek, the water clear and fresh. He dismounted and helped Emily down, allowing her to rest for a moment. They were far from the danger they had left behind, but Jack knew it wasn't over. It never really was.
There were always risks, always dangers waiting just beyond the horizon. But for now, they had peace.
Jack set up camp by the creek, building a small fire and preparing a meal. Emily sat by the fire, her eyes distant as she stared into the flames. She hadn't said much since they had started riding again. But Jack could tell she was thinking, processing everything that had happened. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I never thought I'd find this. A place where I could breathe again. A place where I don't have to be afraid. Jack looked at her, his expression softening. Brass and Despic.
You don't have to be afraid anymore. Not here.
Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she had a chance to live, to be more than just someone running from her past, a chance to heal. Jack sat down beside her, the fire casting shadows on his face. You're safe here. Bah. For as long as you need to be. Emily smiled, a small, uncertain smile, but it was enough.
It was enough to remind her that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold and unforgiving as she had always believed. She wasn't alone anymore.
As the fire crackled and the stars began to fill the night sky, they sat together in silence, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time it didn't feel impossible. Together they had the strength to face whatever came next.